Well, here we are at the Memphis Rock and Soul Museum with John Doyle. Hi, John. How you doing?
Patrick, great. It's great having you here.
Yeah, so we're in a special place here, aren't we?
It is a pretty special place. This is the gateway to Memphis music. You know, when you come to the home of the blues and birthplace of rock and roll, you got to start somewhere. And music started way before Elvis, way before Jerry Lewis or Otis Redding. It actually started in the fields with the sharecroppers, and that's what Memphis Rock and Soul tells about. It's a great story that's told by the Smithsonian Institution that put our whole facility together to trace the origins of rock and soul music, which they maintain are the two only true American genres of music. So it's a great museum, a lot of history, a lot of fun.
Well, I can't wait to get started, and I know when people come here, they get started with a little film, right?
Absolutely. We have a great 12-minute film that really lays the groundwork, because when you come to Memphis, a lot of people think that almost every museum is going to be about Elvis. But this really shows the influence of the African-American music, how it really came into Memphis, and really what all happened before that explosion that changed the whole cultural complexion of the world.
Well, I can't wait to see it. Let's get started.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Wow, is this where it really all started, right here?
Actually, yeah, in this gallery and also at this location where Rock and Soul is. We sit at a historic intersection, at the intersection of historic Beale Street, which I'm sure you've seen, and 3rd Street, which Memphians call 3rd Street. Music folks call the Blues Highway, or Highway 61, where that music migrated out of the Mississippi Delta and folks brought their music. And that was sharecroppers. That was former slaves who came into the city. They brought their music from the front porches and everything. So we're probably the only music museum that starts out with a mule. It really talks about the mule, the real home life of the sharecropper. And this catches a lot of our guests off guard because they expect they're immediately going to walk in, just like if you go in the Rock Hall at Cleveland, and you walk in and you see music memorabilia everywhere. Well, we start with that story, and it was a story of rural people who worked in the dirt, who raised crops. But then we also a lot of times will give credit to Franklin Delano Roosevelt of being the father of rock and roll music, because his New Deal initiatives pushed a lot of people off the farms, as you see here, and they came into the city. As they migrated into the city, they brought their music, whether it was music they played on the front porch or those incredible field hollers that the slaves sung in the cotton fields, and they brought that gospel music, they brought that early blues, and it came in and it started melting together.
And it all happened right here.
Happened in Memphis, Tennessee.
Love it. What's next?
Well, next we go on, and it starts looking a little bit more like a music museum.
Wow, more of the history. This is when it started to become a little more commercial, right?
Absolutely, Patrick. This is what I was referring to. Them coming into the city, and they actually rolled stuff up 3rd Street, up that Blues Highway, and came into Memphis. You know, the musicians we'll see later, and they talk about that influence and stuff. Those early teenagers like Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley, they went on Beale Street, and these folks, Beale Street, which we see today as a music street, as we'll learn in the next gallery, and so it was a commercial street where they lived, and music was just a part of it. But you begin seeing it here in this gallery. We really bringing the music into it. This huge thing right here behind
this big transformer.
Absolutely. Two interesting things. A lot of folks say that this big red thing looks like a Coca-Cola machine.
Yeah.
This is one of the earliest jukeboxes.
Record machine. Records in there,
That's
literally.
exactly what it was.
See them in there,
one of the earliest jukeboxes you would ever find. And the great thing about coming to Rock and Soul, aside from seeing the memorabilia and learning the history, we also, throughout the museum, as everybody has their audio guide going through.
Yeah, I see the numbers and the little headsets right
Absolutely. In every jukebox, they'll also see a list next to it of about 10 to 20 songs that kind of take them through. So aside from hearing the great Smithsonian story, they will also hear the music, because there's about 100 songs throughout Rock and Soul that take you on a progression through the development of rock and soul music. And WSM, one of the legendary radio stations, transmitted the Grand Ole Opry into homes all throughout the Southeast. And so as the future legends of rock and roll began all the influences. They would hear it on Beale Street. They would hear it in churches. Elvis would go to the Pentecostal church with his parents, but he would also slip away and go to the gospel churches of Memphis. And so he got the white hymnal music, and then he also got the gospel African-American music. But then also the Grand Ole Opry had a huge influence into all that country music that a lot of these legends went back to. Jerry Lee went back to country music. And then as you go around this thing, around this gallery, you run into the legendary story of Robert Johnson, who is obviously considered one of the greatest blues legends of all time.
Absolutely.
Eric Clapton made a complete CD of Robert Johnson's songs, despite the fact that Johnson only lived to be 27 years old.
Wow.
And the great stories that when you come to Memphis, you know, any great music city, New Orleans, Memphis, Detroit, we've got great historical stories. And one of the most immortal ones is Robert Johnson, who sold his soul to the devil in order to become a great blues musician.
I heard that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And so all these things fill the galleries of rock and soul as people come. The great thing about this museum, unlike going to a Picasso museum or something like that, we live this. And so regardless of whether we have a 20-year-old or a 70-year-old come through this museum, they remember some aspect. Whether it is, you know, a 20-year-old might not have a clue who Robert Johnson is, but they might have heard that Eric Clapton
Absolutely.
CD.
It's a great place to start.
It's good fun.
Well, check it out. Okay, wow, we're moving on down the highway, and we have a wrestler. What's that all about?
It looks like a costume from like a Kiss concert or
Yeah,
something
right.
like that. So when you have the school groups come through, that's what they think this is where rock and roll started. And actually, to a degree, it did. Before Memphis, Tennessee became the home of the Memphis Grizzlies,
Sure.
wrestling was our professional sports. And so rock and soul not only tells about the musical impact of how it went about to change the whole world, but it's an entertainment thing also. And we're one of the foremost cities that's known for having a black eye from a civil rights standpoint. Obviously, Dr. King was assassinated here at the Lorraine Motel. But Memphis also, at the same time, leaders like Dr. King were leading a social civil rights movement. Memphis was leading a musical civil rights movement. But it was in our entertainment also. Sputnik Monroe was a wrestler here in Memphis, Tennessee, when wrestling was popular. And it was at a time when whites like us got to sit ringside, but blacks sat in the balcony. And Sputnik was so popular, sold tons of tickets. When it came time for him to re-sign his contract with the promoters, he refused to sign that contract until they did away with the black-only balcony. But Sputnik and musicians in these studios began erasing those lines and bringing the races together. Wow. The Smithsonian maintains, aside from Sputnik's costume, their favorite pieces of memorabilia that are in rock and soul are these two original screen doors that are not remakes. These are original screen doors that came out of a retail establishment here in the South.
Yeah, one says colored and one says white.
Yeah, but places like Beale Street, musicians like Elvis Presley, entertainers like Sputnik Monroe began erasing those lines. And so rock and soul was not just a music museum, it's a civil rights museum.
Absolutely. Thank God we've come this far, you know.
Absolutely. The other cool thing about this gallery is folks come from that last gallery walkthrough, and I didn't realize this myself when I came here as executive director, but this gallery you walk in, and the gallery itself is divided. You come down this wall over here and you learn about Beale Street. Further back, WDIA Radio, the first black formatted radio station in the world. This started right here. The owners who were Caucasian on that radio station, and they saw a niche, and they began to play black music, and they hired black musicians, legendary musicians that became disc jockeys, legendary musicians like Rufus Thomas. B.B. King was a disc jockey on WDIA radio. And just like WSM we talked about earlier, WDIA is still on the air, one of the leading radio stations in Memphis, Tennessee. But on the opposite side of this gallery, over here, it's all Caucasian.
Okay,
the way that music
absolutely.
the way that music began integrating into our television, stations like WMC TV here in Memphis began playing real rockabilly and rural white music. Legendary disc jockeys like Dewey Phillips, who was the very first disc jockey to interview Elvis Presley. When Elvis first released that record, a great story about Sam Phillips pressing That's All Right Mama. People think that Elvis probably walked into Sun Studios and immediately it was magic. That was actually his 5th trip into Sun Studios. And Sam Phillips, legendary owner of Sun Studios, was unimpressed with Elvis totally and could never find a niche for him. But he went in, and I'll tell you the story later about him kind of finding that niche and recording That's All Right Mama. They recorded on a Tuesday, Sam pressed it, and on Thursday took it down to Dewey Phillips, who ran Red Hot and Blues radio show in the evening on WHBQ radio. And Dewey wanted to do an interview with Elvis, who they tried to find out where he was, called his mom at home, and he was at a local movie theater. They got him out of the movie.
He was a kid at the time.
He was a kid.
Yeah.
All this was new to him, and they took him to that radio studio to do an interview that was in the Chiska Hotel, 2 blocks away from here. And when Elvis went in there, he said, "Mr. Phillips, I've never done an interview before. What do I do?" And all he said was, "Don't cuss." They did the interview. Elvis said, "When will it air?"
Well, that's what I told you, right? Don't cuss.
Don't
That's
cuss.
It. Same
That's
thing.
it.
That's pretty cool.
The interesting civil rights part about the Dewey Phillips story was he asked Elvis what high school he went to, because Elvis attended Humes High School, which identified to the radio audience that Elvis was white, because Humes was a white school.
Got it.
And it began to show, because the style of music Elvis sang A lot of the listeners thought Elvis Presley was African American, just like the DJs on WHBQ, they thought they were African American because they were mimicking the WDI style.
Yes, yes.
That's the way the races began to come together.
So it's an example of music bringing people together.
That's exactly what it's all about.
Right? Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Exactly right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's keep going. I love it.
Wow.
Well, now that we know how the music got started, now they got to capture it and then get it out to the masses. That's where the recording comes in.
Starting to look like a little bit like a museum right here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and this kind of tells the story, this gallery kind of tells the story of Sun Studios. Legendary studio started by Sam Phillips. Most folks don't know it began as an African-American recording studio. That's what Sam Phillips did. And also an interesting story, Ike Turner, the infamous former husband of Tina Turner, was his talent scout. And Ike Turner would go into the Mississippi Delta to find blues musicians and bring them into Sun Studio on Union Avenue, which is still open as a tourist attraction here in Memphis, and record these great blues musicians. Sam Phillips, being more of an entrepreneur than a civil rights leader, he was looking for a way to expand his business. And so this sound system that you see here, which is the original sound system out of Sun Studios.
Amazing.
That the legendary $1 Million Quartet of Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley recorded on. But Sam Phillips was looking at a way to expand his business. So he was looking for a white guy that could sing black music.
Oh, yeah, crossover.
Absolutely.
That's what we call it now.
Yeah, and he brought these musicians in, and what musicians always thought that Sam Phillips wanted was what the music that was popular that day, which was crooner music. Bing Crosby, Pat Boone. And so they kept providing those types of songs. So Sam wasn't finding what he was wanting. And this immortal session that was taking place at Sun Studios, that's what Elvis, Scotty Moore, and the other band members were providing to Sam Phillips, and he was real dissatisfied with what he was getting on this particular recording session. They took a break, and during the break, the band members, the musicians, started doing what they loved doing, and that was just playing the music that they liked listening to, the music they would hear on Beale Street. So they started cutting up and playing great blues music, which is what they were then listening to, hearing it on WDIA radio or hearing it on Beale Street. That's when Sam Phillips heard it, and he said that's what he was looking for. He was looking for the rhythmic music of African Americans being sung by white musicians, and that kind of exploded rock and roll right there. But it really changed the whole cultural complexion of the world. The Smithsonian Institution maintains that English is the business language around the globe because non-English speaking countries began singing these immortal lyrics that came out of Memphis, Tennessee, and that's how they learned our language. Wow. So in this gallery, aside from that immortal sound system from Sun Studios, you'll see legendary memorabilia from Elvis Presley, even from great blues musicians that originally played in Sun Studios and evolved it into that legendary studio that it is today.
And we have a piano back there. Now, whose piano was that?
That's Ike Turner's piano. That was also in Sun Studios,
Gosh, there's so much going on in here.
Absolutely.
Now, let's see what's next.
Okay.
Right on. Well, I see the big Stax sign up here, so that has something to do with Stax Studios, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Legendary soul music that came out of Stax Studios, also other labels like Volt, High Records, and that really evolved here. And just like the museum's name evolved, a lot of people think of Memphis for rock and roll and for soul music. And as you're learning, Patrick, so much of this is evolution of music.
Absolutely.
It's not just black music, it's not just white music, it's kind of the way it came together. But great memorabilia, Isaac Hayes, once he became famous and became immortal for his outlandish outfits. And so we have his Wolverine cape and mink coat. But then this great diamond and emerald watch that he designed himself that has that grand piano.
Bling.
It wasn't just a slow evolution, but there was this explosion of what happened here in Memphis. Because you would go to somewhere else in the U.S., a Pat Boone concert, people would sit in seats and they would listen to, and after each song, they would politely
clap. Yeah.
Exactly. And students that come through today, through rock and soul, they can learn really how we celebrate music and why it happened. Why we jump up and throw things on the stage, why we flick Bic lighters at concerts, why we don't really use seats at concerts, we stand up the whole time. And this explosion happened when this merging together of that radical African-American rhythmic music merged together with some white teen musicians and came together. And it continued like we talked about at Stax Records. Stax started, and although it's known as a legendary soul label, it played a role in that civil rights movement as well. And you have great instrumental groups like the Marquees, the Barkays, that came out of Stax Records, and a lot of times they were black musicians and white musicians together, and they would travel. They'd have to, they'd have the struggles of what hotel they stayed in because
got to separate it up,
exactly right. So, it's a great civil rights story. So when you go through rock and soul, aside from I lived this, or my grandmother used to have a record player like that, or my dad used to have those 8-track tapes stuffed in his glove compartment. You also get this feel of your soul, of really what happened and how this really changed you as a person.
Yep, not only in music, but in civil rights as well. Like I say, it changed the world.
Yeah, absolutely. The civil rights, if you pulled the civil rights story out of rock and roll, there would be no rock and roll.
That's right. That's what made today.
And the rebelliousness also. Sam Phillips said, if it weren't for the total contempt on the part of the parents, rock and roll would have had a tougher time of making it. It was such a revolutionary, rebellious attitude of young teenagers, both black and white, that came together and grasped this music that came out of High Records, that came out of Stax Records and Sun Records, and it changed a generation, and in doing so, changed an entire planet.
Well, they found their common ground, and that's what it was all about.
That's exactly right.
This is amazing. What do we got next?
Let's look at a little Elvis stuff.
Well, we couldn't get through the tour without a little bit of Elvis now, could we?
You can't come through a museum in Memphis without having a little Elvis stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And in some of those earlier galleries, we have an early dulcimer that was given to Elvis by the Cash family, Johnny Cash's family. You have his first guitar that he played when he was in the armed forces in Germany. There's a low brand guitar that's in there that he purchased when he went in the armed forces, and so it's the guitar that he serenaded a young teenage Priscilla before their marriage. But then you have to go into the jumpsuit area.
Yeah, and then I haven't seen anything. We were over there, and this is a real cool.
This is a nice one right here, Patrick. This is one of the places that we constantly have to dust this little platform right here.
People get on here and take pictures.
People want to see because they're surprised at how tall the jumpsuit is.
Actually, yeah. Well, I'm up here, so and I'm about 6 feet tall.
He's a tall guy.
Yeah, he was about 5'11", 6 feet tall.
Yeah, he was pretty tall, and a lot of folks, wore a size 13 shoe. And
that's a big shoe.
Yeah, a lot of us think that he was our height, but he was taller than us. But the jumpsuit fad began with, Elvis started when he was still slender, in the middle part of his career.
Well, it's his superhero suit.
That's exactly right.
Serious.
Yeah. What I talked about before about really living the whole rock and roll experience when you come through Memphis and you come through museums like this. This blue coat that you find right behind you, which is great. We used to have 2 jumpsuits, and for that great exhibit over at Graceland, they asked for one of them back, and they gave us this on loan, this blue coat, which it doesn't look like a blue coat you and I'd wear, but it looks like a standard blue coat. But if folks will remember a legendary photograph of Elvis Presley standing with Muhammad Ali, wearing that coat right there.
That's right. Oh, that is the coat, isn't it?
That's the coat. Yeah, exactly. At first, when we got it, we thought it was the coat that he was wearing when he met with President Richard Nixon, which there's a great story about that. When he went into the White House to meet with Richard Nixon, he actually had a revolver stuck in his boot that no one in the White House knew about. Yeah, exactly.
They didn't have a little pass-through there.
They didn't have that at the time.
Oh, boy.
So there's some great stories about all these musicians that come on. When you come into the 70s and you see these influences kind of emerging more into rock and roll, and you have bands like the Gentrys, the Box Tops, legendary bands like Big Star that came out of Memphis, and then you have novelty acts, the #1 party song of all time, Wooly Bully, recorded by Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, who also recorded Little Red Riding Hood and some other songs. And Sam is Sam Samudio, the lead singer of Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs, who took up that whole Pharaoh image, despite the fact he's Latino himself. Serves on the board of directors of Rock and Soul and has things on loan. This motorcycle overhead that was on his album, which he won a Grammy for liner notes, and followed the lead of other artists like Elvis, with the bling, and did the turban to carry forth the Egyptian theme.
Right on. And then now, after the music, we're getting into civil rights a little.
Yeah, civil rights a little bit, which has an interesting musical story about it itself that I'll share with you about the final minutes of Dr. King and how music continued to play in that role of civil rights.
Let's go over here and check it out. So you have a saxophone here now. What does a saxophone have to do with civil rights?
Again, we've talked also a lot, like you mentioned, about civil rights, and civil rights plays a thread throughout all of Memphis and throughout the whole form and evolution of rock and roll and soul music, obviously. But as I referenced, Memphis is also known for the unfortunate assassination of Dr. King. You know, a couple of pieces of memorabilia, Patrick. Right behind you is one of those cardboard placards that we've seen a million times when the sanitation workers were striking here in Memphis that brought Dr. King to Memphis. And they wore those I Am a Man, which really goes into really what a lot of the Rock and Soul Museum in itself is about. You know, those African American musicians that were considered less significant, that weren't allowed to stay in the hotels, that, you know, weren't allowed to play on certain stages that the Caucasian musicians were allowed to do. And so it is a civil rights in the same way that those sanitation workers wore that I Am a Man placard to, you know, really gain significance in that support of Dr. King. Referring back to that saxophone, kind of a very sad but a very impactful story of the final minutes of Dr. King. Ben Branch was a musician here in Memphis, Tennessee. This saxophone is on loan from his wife. In just minutes, when Dr. King, Reverend Jackson, Dr. Abernathy came out of that hotel room that you can still see at the Lorraine Motel at the Civil Rights Museum, they walked out onto that balcony. They were going to a lady's house for dinner that had invited them to dinner while they were here in town. They walked out onto that balcony, and people were gathered in the parking lot below that you can still visit the Civil Rights Museum. And Ben Branch was there, who Dr. King knew, and he spoke to Ben Branch and said, who had a saxophone, this particular saxophone, said, "Ben, play me my favorite song," which was "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," which Ben Branch played right there in the parking lot of the Civil Rights Museum, literally about 5 minutes before the assassination of Dr. King. Wow. One of the final pieces of music, a legendary favorite piece of music of Dr. King's that he heard before that that horrible shot that, you know, really changed American history so much. And so we're very proud to have this here, and, you know, really all the memorabilia, but, you know, it's impactful the way that music that exploded out of Memphis, Tennessee changed so many lives, both positive and negatives, but really hits us all from some place or another. So everyone who comes and visits the Rock and Soul Museum, they leave with different experiences that have touched their lives and the way that their lives have been changed. It might be a Stax record or song, it might be a Sun record, it might be something that they partied to, it might be a hymn that they had in church, but in some way or another, the Rock and Soul Museum really shows how this music impacted our life and how a small city like Memphis, you know, really exploded and changed, you know, global culture.
You know, I'm blown away, literally.
Memphis music blows folks away, it does.
Absolutely, thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
It's a pleasure having you here. It's great having you at the Rock and Soul Museum. You know, folks are invited. The Smithsonian Institution put together an incredible museum here about the whole influence of rock and soul music. So it's great having you.
Yeah, when you're in Memphis, you got to get out here, everybody. And thank you so much for being here with us today. And until next time, just remember to enjoy.